everybody, today I'm going to be reading Chapter 13 of the Enola Holmes mystery, The Case of the Missing Marquess. Marquess, sorry about that. Chapter the 13th. I froze, cowering like a rabbit in a thicket. But from the other side of the hole an impetuous voice spoke. What for? I desire this boat to rock. I demand, nay, I command this boat to rock, and rock it did. For there sat young Vincent Tewkesbury, Marquess of Bayswater, leaning back to front and back again, disturbing our prison's response. Ye there, Squeaky's flinty stare turned to him. Stop it! Make me, haughtily. Lord Tewkesbury met his glare and kept rocking. Ye want me to make you? Squeaky lurched to his feet. Think you're a toff, do you? By jingo, I'll show ye. Fist balled, he walked over to Tewkesbury, and in doing so, he turned his back to me. I sat up, twisted around, leaning to one side, fumbling again to find the corset rib with my bound hands. With vicious force, our captor kicked young Tewkesbury in the leg. The boy made no sound, but I would have cried out. I wanted to strike, seize, and stop that nasty man. Indeed, I lost my head entirely, struggling against the cords that bound my wrists so wildly that it seemed I would wrench my arms out of their sockets. Then something snapped. It hurt terribly. Squeaky kicked Tewkesbury again. Keep going, the boy said. I like it. But his strained voice showed that he lied. My arms hurt so badly that I had broken a bone. I thought I had broken a bone, rather than the cord, until I found myself looking at my own hands, which had presented themselves in front of my face, like disreputable strangers, battered, bloodied, rags of hemp dripping from their wrists. You like it? I'll see you like it. Squeaked over scurvy wretch of a guard, kicking Lord Tewkesbury for the third time, quite hard. This time Tweaky whimpered, and simultaneously I rose to my feet, my ankles still bound, but walking was not necessary. As I stood briefly behind our captor, my hands, which seemed to know what to do better than I did, selected a large rock from the ballast. Even as Squeaky cocked his leg to kick again, before he could do so, I hoisted my primitive weapon and brought it down with great decision upon his head. He fell without a sound, splashed into the large bilge water, and I lay still. I stood gawking at him. Idiot! Untie my hands, cried Lord Tewkesbury. The drowned man continued as he was, inert but breathing. Untie me, fool! The boy's peremptory tone prodded me into motion. I turned my back to him. Ninny, what are you doing? I was preserving my scant, remaining unmodesty, although I did not tell him so. Unbuttoning part of my voice, I reached deep into my frontal baggage and found the penknife I had removed from my drawing kit and stowed in my bust enhancer, along with the pencil and some folded sheets of paper. After buttoning up again, I opened the penknife, stopped, cut the cords away from my ankles. Unable to see these proceedings through the expanse of black skirt, Lord Tewkesbury, giving orders, and actually began to beg. Please, I saw what you were doing, and I helped you, didn't I? Please, you... Shh, in a moment. Once I had freed my feet, I turned, stepped past the motionless form of our guard, then leaned over the captive boy with one quick snick. I severed the cord binding his hands behind his back. Then I handed him the knife so he could free his feet himself. On the skirt of my ruined dress, I wiped the blood from my wrists. I looked at the cuts, not so deep as to be dangerous, then felt at my hair, which had fallen out of any semblance of a bun to straggle around my shoulders, finding a few hairpins in its tangles. I tried to close the rip in my dress with them. Do come on, urged young Viscount Tewkesbury, now on his feet with my penknife still open, gripped like a weapon in his hand. Right, of course. There was no time to make me to make myself look presentable. Nodding, I approached the ladder that led to freedom, with Lord Tewkesbury at my side. As we reached it, however, we hesitated, eyeing each other. "Ladies first, his lordship?" Uncertainly. "I yield in favor of the gentleman," I responded, thinking only that a girl must never place herself in such a position that a male look up her skirt, not at all thinking what might await us above. Nodding, still clutching the penknife, Tewkesbury climbed the ladder. Light blinded me as he lifted the hatch. Night had passed into day, whether morning or afternoon I knew not. I retain only a vague, blinking silhouetted impression of the cautious way the young Viscount put his head forth and leaned around. Quite silently he laid the hatch covers aside and climbed out, beckoning urgently to me. Climbing as quickly as I could, I realized he was waiting for me, his hand extended to help me out of the hole, despite having called me in close succession an idiot, a fool, and a ninny. The boy showed traces of gallantry. He would have been wiser to flee without me, but it seemed right that we had been prisoners together, we would escape together. Certainly it had not occurred to me to leave him behind, and evidently he had not thought to leave me behind either. Reaching at the top of the ladder, I grasped his hand. An awful voice roared a curse such as I had never previously heard or imagined. As my head rose above the level of the hatch, I saw a tall, massive, scarlet form hurtle out of a cabin and across a too brief expanse of the deck toward us. In that awful moment, I learned that the gentleman, or at least a certain ungentle man, wore unmentionables made of blood-red flannel. From wrist to ankle, I screamed, "Come on!" Springing to his feet, Tewkesbury all but lifted me off the ladder, flinging me away from the charging red menace. "Run!" He looked as though he intended to hold the brute on with his little penknife. "You run!" Hoisting a wad of skirt and a petticoat above my knees with one hand, I grabbed him by the collar with the other as I fled to the far end of the boat. Together, although necessarily, I let go of him. We leapt across a yard of water to the wobbly planking of what I suppose might be called a pier. Then, halting at my skirt with both hands, I ran as fast as I could along that narrow, unsteady path. "You won't get far," bellowed a ferocious voice from the boat. Just wait until I got some clothes on and my hands on you." Being long of limb, I like to run, not tripping over my own confounded clothing, but definitely not on labyrinth of rotting green slimed planks, a bewilderment of piers and blackish water, wharves and catwalks, and yet more stinking water lay between us and the taverns and the warehouse that rose at the edge of the Thames. "Which way?" gasped Tweaky, for I could no longer think him as Lord, Viscount, Duke's son. He was my comrade now, panting along right behind me. I can't tell. Surrounded by the dark water, at a dead end, we slipped and skittered, turning to a dark back. Once an arm of water blocked our way. I began to shake. I fell into that black river. It would be the end for me. I would drown. I doubted whether Tewkesbury could swim either. But there was no time for dithering. At too scant a distance, our massive enemy sprang out of his cabin again, with some decent covering thrown onto his person this time, roaring, "I'll kill you both," like a charging bear that lunged from his craft onto the labyrinth wave. Even worse, a small crooked form followed himself the way a starved dog follows a beggar. Evidently, I had not hit Squeaky hard enough. "Jump!" I wailed, and with my skirts billowing, I leapt for another pier. It rocked me, but I managed to keep my footing, and just as I gasped for air, it rocked again, even worse, as Tewkesbury landed with a thump beside me. Lacking breath to scream outright, I squeaked like a clothesline reel. Tweaky grabbed my arm, crying, "Run!" and this time he led as we fled. At some point he had lost my penknife, and his right hand trembled weaponless. My shaking red doubled, for I felt the heavy tread of the cutthroat quaking on the dock beneath us. "Oh no," I cried as we slid into the halt at the end of another pier that led nowhere. Tweaky said something unresentable. "Shame on you. This way." Turning, I took the lead again, and in a few moments we scrambled to firmer footing of cobbles, brick, and mortar. But our enemies, who knew their way, reached shore just as we did. Only a stone's throw behind us, but I could see blood on Squeaky's head, the rage in his squinty eyes. I could see the hair in the big cutthroat's ears, and wrath reddening his platter face. Blood on the moon, an ill omen, I confess. I screamed again. Indeed, I shrieked like a shot rabbit. Blindly, with Tuki's hand in mine, I fled up a narrow street and around a corner. Hurry! Zigzagging between heavily loaded wagons drawn by straining draft horses, we ran at an angle across the street to the next turning. By now out of breath, moist of face and dress, all too aware of the heat of the day, I could still hear running footsteps following us. Tweaky had stopped behind. Dragging him along, I could feel a wince of pain in his every stride. His feet, bare, sore, hitting on hard stone, and it was all uphill, fleeing from the river. "Come on." "Can't," the boy panted, trying to yank his hand out of mine. I tightened my grip. "Indeed you can. You must. You go. Save yourself." "No." Blinking away my blind panic, I looked around me as we ran. We seemed to be reaching the end of wagons and docks and warehouses. Now we ran along a poor street of shabby lodgings and even shabbier businesses. A fishmonger's, a pawn shop, an umbrella mender, and street vendors. Live mussels, live oysters, sweet ices here, cold, sweet strawberry ices. There were people about, dusting man with donkey cart, men with barrows of scrap metal, women and girls afoot in caps and aprons that would have been white but had grinned to the color of mushrooms. People, but not the sort of likely to help us, and not enough of them so that a barefoot fleeing boy could escape notice, let alone a breathless, disheveled, bareheaded girl in the torn, blood-smeared dress of a widow. "Stop, thieves!" bellowed a voice behind us, horse still rocking. "Stop those two scoundrels! Villains! Pickpockets!" Face turned to stare at Tuki and me as we fled through a street of junk stores, second-hand furniture, used clothing, hats refurbished, shoes and boots resold. Used clothing again. Faces seemed to rise out of a haze of heat and terror, loom for a moment, then flash by. One of the faces I knew in passing, although I could not think where I had seen it before. Then, as we ran, I remembered. "Tweaky, quick!" Dodging off the street, I darted up a narrow passageway toward between the two ramshackle boarding houses. I turned past the corner of a cowshed and fled through the stinking mews of behind buildings. Redent donkeys, goat, goose, hen. I turned again. "You can't get away!" a fearsome voice roared from behind the cowshed. Far too close for comfort. "Give it up!" yelled another voice. Squeaky. "Idiot!" Tewksbury cried, evidently addressing me. "Why are we going in a circle? They'll catch us. You'll see. Follow me." Letting go of his hand, also of my remaining shreds of modesty, I ripped open the buttons of my upper boys. Running down quite a filthy alley, I thrust my forearm into my frontal baggage, and my fingers encountering a packet of crisp papers, withdrew one, hiding it in my palm. As I rounded the final corner, back into the street, I dashed toward a used clothing store. The perpetrator stood outside the door, enjoying the street scene and the cooling breeze. But when she saw me making towards her, her cheery expression chilled and turned to alarm. Rather than resembling a robin or a toad, she looked like a mouse under the paw of a cat. "No," she gasped as I ran up to her. "No cutter would kill me. It's more than my life is worth." There was no time for discussion. Tweaky and I only had a moment before the two villains would round the corner and sight us again. In that moment I thrust a black note for £100 into hands. Presumably, Mrs. Cullen grabbed Tweaky up by the sleeve and dragged him with me into Cullen's used clothing emporium. End of chapter 13.